Hello, I'm Luna Santifanti, and this here with me is Dr. James Nagan of Durham University, soon to be Liverpool John Moores.
Woo!
So we're going to go through, what's the plan, kind of what is science, what's the scientific method, how is it applied. This is a session for just beginning. So we're going to leave out a lot of jargon, and it's going to be a lot more about the concepts and trying to understand those. It's going to give you a very beginning kind of introductory textbook kind of research methods kind of outline. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to take our faces off of here and go to the slides. So I've called it Thinking Like a Scientist. Critical skills for evaluating and planning research. So it should also build some of your critical thinking skills to evaluate research findings, research proposals, and also give you an idea about how science is done and how we come up with research questions and how we then test those research questions using various methods. So I'll just get onto my slides. So science is a search for truth. Some people call it epistemology. So to think like a researcher, you have to be skeptical. A lot of researchers think about ideas or read about literature and are skeptical and have a skeptical attitude towards those. It doesn't mean that they don't believe anything, but they want to see it before they believe it. And usually they want to see it happen again and again before they believe it, and usually under different conditions than someone's own choosing. So that means that research is replicable, that it has been replicated again and again. And usually it's a skeptical attitude about whether the causes that are being claimed in some study or some event outside in the real world, whether it could be caused by something other than what people are claiming it to be caused by.
Yeah, like another way I've heard it explained is what you do is you think about if you didn't believe what you believe, what would you do to prove it? And then you try and do that yourself.
And all of us, are kind of mini researchers. A lot of us observe people in the outside world and what they're doing, what their behavior is, and make hypotheses or theories about what underlies that behavior. So a lot of us do this all the time. What separates us from science is when we develop a skeptical attitude and actually do things in a systematic way, observe in a systematic way. So even my child a couple days ago said to me, I think middle siblings and sole children in families are similar in certain kinds of attitudes and behaviors. That's, quite a testable thing to look at. It's probably based on some observations that they made at, age 13. So, that's a budding scientist right there, perhaps. But it takes more than just going, I think that these, siblings are the same as only children. So as I kind of previewed, the characteristics of scientific and non-scientific or everyday kind of observations is the way that it's approached and the way that it's systematic. So non-scientific is intuitive. You might trust your intuition about what you think is true about, for example, men or women. And in scientific terms, it's usually an empirical process, so something where they're engaged in, well, we'll get into that later, in scientific process. The attitude in non-scientific is uncritical or accepting. It may be that you tend to accept what you already believe, so you accept data or research or claims that already kind of are aligned with what you already believe. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's quite true of humans. And in scientific process, we develop a critical and skeptical attitude. Observations are casual and uncontrolled and non-scientific, and are hopefully controlled and systematic and scientific. The reporting is in non-scientific way is biased and subjective, and hopefully in scientific is we look for unbiased, objective truths. And the concepts for non-scientific are usually ambiguous with a lot of different meanings. And in scientific, you have clear definitions and operational specificity. So that's really just meaning the same thing. Clear definitions, specific definitions that can't be aligned to something else. The instruments in non-scientific aren't inaccurate or imprecise. Maybe you're just watching people as you go about your day at lunchtime, which could be different than what people behave like at other times of the day. The instruments in scientific are accurate and precise. The measurements are different as well, being non-valid or valid, and hypotheses are either untestable or testable. So again, we do this as humans, but science is more systematic and critical.
Yeah, it's kind of in a way, it's a process that's a little bit humbling. You have to give up just sort of being like the all-knowing expert and instead go to a system where it's based on evidence, which is not to say that the scientists themselves and their perspective and all that is unimportant, not at all. But you do kind of, by doing this, sort of go over to something where you're trying to make it that the observations and the arguments themselves are really solid instead of being based more on your own ethos.
And I think part of that is just being, as a scientist, aware of what your ethos are. So it's not that it's unbiased or objective all of the time. It's really difficult for scientists to take themselves out of the research because they're humans.
Oh, yeah.
And we all make mistakes. But it's about knowing what your biases are before you undertake it, or including other scientists in your research as collaborators who are maybe taking a diverse point of view. So I've just recently collaborated with two men who hadn't even considered including women in a study that I thought was really important to include. But, if they hadn't had me on board kind of arguing why that would be important, and to be fair to them, the research on this topic typically only includes men. So, they were following what previous research has done, but I think that's the benefit of having different points of view, is that you get to know what your bias is and maybe to question it and understand if it's something that you should actually rally against or it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, you're never going to have zero bias, but through the use of multiple perspectives and while designing the research, you can reduce it a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go on to the next one. So as it said, science is empirical. And you can kind of think about empirical being about evidence, right? And you can kind of think about a trial or a criminal investigation if you've ever watched. I used to watch a lot of crime, dramas, and I thought they were really fun. And I guess part of that was that I thought it was really interesting about how they gather evidence and how they evaluate that evidence. And usually, again, it's, they're collecting evidence. They're looking to see if it's corroborated. So are they finding multiple avenues that give them the same answer? So if they're looking at DNA and it's giving them the same thing as like a witness testimony and the same thing as, all kinds of things. So they're looking for different sources. And that's the next one, the different sources of evidence with their own reliability. So we know that witness testimony is not that reliable. DNA has a lower chance of error depending on how it was collected. And so all those things can then tell you about the different, how those sources are given weight or reliability. And then it tells us about the probability that they are guilty with different levels of evidence. So a small amount of evidence might be enough to suspect. A large amount of evidence would be enough to convict, right? So, and you can see, I just copied and pasted this from the internet, but, the kind of like, well, if there's reasonable doubt, clear and convincing evidence, preponderance of evidence, and each of these talk about the trustworthiness, the reasonableness of the information, that it's not based on a hunch or a guess. Again, that kind of intuition, that would be really evidence that's not given very much weight if it's a suspicion or a hunch. unless it's corroborated by something that's a little bit more substantial. So that just gives you an idea of how the two kind of line up together. So to talk about the scientific method, as I said, the search for knowledge or process of gaining knowledge is epistemology. And throughout time, from very, very long time ago, thousands of years ago, humans have used faith, intuition, common sense, logic, passive observation, and the scientific method. And I don't know that it's always gone in that linear order. Sometimes it seems like we've gone backwards and forwards.
So it's a tree. It's a tree. It kind of branches back into itself. Yeah. Well, for a lot of things, you can't slow down and take a scientific method, right? Like I can't do a study to figure out which kind of coffee I like better from Tesco because I've got things to do and I need to buy coffee and get on with it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes, and actually those things could probably come before or after each other within a single thinking session of a researcher.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Like you go, oh, I've seen this thing, I have an intuition about it, I'm gonna go see what kind of literature is out there, if anyone's tested this before, has anyone looked at this before, and then and then test it out yourself using a scientific process.
Yeah.
Not a single session, but you know what I mean, like these things can coexist nowadays in the research process.
Right. And maybe it's worth calling out too that sometimes you go read something and you say like, oh, this is a really good idea, or like this is a really interesting idea, and if this is true, it's really important for some particular kind of practice or something like that. And then you look at the evidence and you realize there are gaps in the evidence, and then you go design a study that tries to just sort of re-examine the same idea that's already been out there, but examine it better, examine it more rigorously, and sometimes you find out it holds up. And you know what? You're still very much contributing to the way the scientific process is supposed to be, right? The attitude here is we want things to be based on as much and as solid evidence as we can to believe them. So if you just come across a good idea that you think hasn't been tested properly and you go test it properly, you are making a huge contribution to science still.
Yeah. But even like just talking about the intuition and common sense part, my colleague, Mina Lyons at Liverpool, does a lot of like interesting research. And I think she did some stuff on Tinder, and how...
Same thing.
People... just pick up random people. On Tinder, a lot of people lie, right?
Oh,
I'm not on Tinder. But I've heard, there's quite a big population who don't exactly tell the truth and have the maybe present the best part of their pictures and things like this.
Is that not all of Tinder? It sounds like every part of Tinder.
Yeah, and my lawyer friend does a lot of research on this as well, but from a different point of view. Mina is more interested in personality. So she was interested in whether people who lie a lot, I should have looked up the study right before doing this, but anyway, it was about like noticing that maybe liars on Tinder, or frequent liars on Tinder, might be more kind of higher on the dark triad, so Machiavellianism, psychopathy, narcissism, and yeah, so she did some research on that to find out, because there hadn't been anything. I mean, Tinder's quite new,
right?
At least to scientists. The nerds were like, oh, what's this thing? So yeah, the scientific method is based on then gathering that evidence, analyzing it, so being very analytical, but also being critical of the way you've done it, because no one, when you're designing a study and doing it, that you haven't designed the perfect study.
Right.
So you have to be critical of your own research, and having no skin in the game and avoiding bias is the best way to do that, because
right.
I think once you think this is do or die, that's gonna introduce that bias and make you not question what you found. And then peer agreement, so seeking agreement by other people in the same field, that's part of the scientific method as well. So we have things like your peers comment on your research and give you advice on what to do next or how to improve it. And we want these results, again, to be found again and again and under different circumstances. And we want the results to be generalized to the real world or applied in some way to the real world. Otherwise, what's the point of doing the research? I mean, it has to at least be applied to a scientific advancement, like you were saying. You know, you're still advancing science if you're improving on basic science that has been done in the past, or improving on
the level
treatment interventions or something like this.
Improving the level of evidence for current theory. Right. I mean, maybe a way to think about it is like we showed you that staircase earlier. You don't always jump from the bottom stair to the top stair in one study. You know, like there's this thing called Bell's inequality in physics, which was a theorem that was brought up by someone in like the late 60s sometime, and it predicted a specific like physical phenomenon at the quantum level. And basically, physicists are still revising experiments to try and find out if this is true or not. There have been so many cycles where someone said, "Oh, I've proved that quantum particles really do this Bell's inequality thing," and then someone else looked at it later and realized, well, there's a little problem here. It could be this instead. And they've done this over and over again for decades. And I don't know, who knows if they'll ever be completely satisfied that this is a true property of physics while I'm still around to watch it, right? But yeah, you want to try the science involves a kind of leap out and leap into the general, right? So you have some kind of general principle, and then you leap out of the general into the specific. You say, we're going to do this specific study. And then you want to be able to leap back into the general and say, we think this means something generally, which is why, that step there is sort of an abstraction, a generalization, and that's why scientific research is ongoing, right? We always want to know more to be able to test that further.
Great. Let's move on to the next one. So science doesn't, I think we've said this, scientists don't exist in a vacuum. Science involves humans observing and analyzing. So as humans, we make mistakes, or as humans, we are biased. So there's at least three contexts to consider when you're considering scientific research, and their context is historical context, sociocultural, and moral context. So historical being things like, what was going on, what was the political context of the time, and why did that research take place in that time, and what research hadn't been done in that time because of the political context. So, nowadays I think there's a lot more, for example, Black researchers doing research that is much more relevant and takes into account different factors than people had been thinking of before. The research that took place during World War II,
right,
under Nazi regime, was maybe related to kind of how we think about how some people are saying today about looking at who's, the best fit kind of person.
Right.
So I think understanding that, there's also the social cultural aspect. So, for example, I just was a couple years ago heard about this study. I can post like some references after I post this video, but the marshmallow test. I don't know if you heard about it, but kids were asked to have. Well, usually, sometimes it was done with M&Ms, marshmallows. So they're given one item that they really like and asked to sit in front of it and wait for 1 or 2 minutes until the experimenter, or as sometimes parents do who are psychologists do to their own children, wait until the adult comes back and says, oh, you've waited all this time, you can now have 2. So they're told in the beginning, you can have 1, or if you wait this amount of time, you can have 2. So basically, it's what they call delay gratification. You're delaying the gratification that you're going to get from eating the marshmallow or one M&M. And what they found was that kids who were able to delay gratification had better outcomes in adulthood with the kinds of jobs that they were getting, the kind of money that they were making, those sorts of things. So I think a lot of people had studied this since, I don't know, I think the first study was in the 70s or 80s.
70s or 80s, yeah. And I know where you're going with this, and then it turns out I haven't heard this, but I'm going to guess that turns out it depends on the socio-cultural context in which the population actually lives, right? So if you do that with one group of people, it's predictive of who's going to be making more money later in life. And if you do it with a different group of people, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Is that the punchline?
Basically.
Called it! Called it!
So kids who, you can imagine, if you live in poverty, for example, you're going to take things as you have them.
Right.
Because you don't know when you're going to get that thing again. You eat your meal now because you don't know when you're going to have your next meal.
Right.
You're not going to, savor that for like a few days. You don't know when it makes a different kind of strategy, which is not inborn. Mm-hmm. It's something you've learned because of the way that, these things that you want are given to you.
Right.
They're paced in that way. In the same way that people would get, if you're not American, but people would get like welfare checks or get their allowance for the month who were poor from the government. They'd get some amount of money. And people would get people who weren't poor would be like, why are they spending all their money right away? Because they're not going to get another check until the beginning of next month. But when you have so little, it's really hard to understand. It's, as a person who has a lot, it's really hard to understand what a poor person's going through when they have a little and they get more at certain times of the month. And in the same way, these kids are responding in the way that they are situated in a poor family. So for people that were rich, the marshmallow test had no information, no explanation of their outcomes as adults. So really it was, if you were rich, you were going to do well as an adult.
Right.
If you were a rich kid. If you were a poor kid, you weren't going to do so well as an adult, but it had nothing to do with the delay of gratification. It was just basically like, this is a systemic problem of being poor.
Right.
So once you can kind of control for or look at the SES, the socioeconomic status that these people are living in, then that had no the SES had more predictability than their delay of gratification. Yeah,
very practical hint here, something that comes up a lot in psychology in practice is like, you want to think about if you're going to do a study with, on undergraduates at the university, you want to think about whether or not that's something that you're studying, you want to think about whether or not the thing you're studying is something you expect to be a pattern that will be the same in college students versus other populations, and you want to think about that when you're interpreting it. That comes up a lot.
Yeah, so I think it's also important to think about, again, if you hadn't thought about another variable, another, socioeconomic status in that study wasn't thought of. So there was an alternative explanation for their study. It wasn't, and some of it's kind of sad because you think about 20, 30 years of this study going on. We thought it was delay of gratification. We thought it was how much grit a child had to whether they would succeed, and what I think, what's important to us at the University of Liverpool in Department of Clinical Psychology is that kind of social justice ideas, that a lot of these things are systemic. And so maybe a lot of people had spent time in schools going, you need to develop the skills to delay gratification, when that wasn't going to help any poor child get ahead in life. So it's, these things, I get really upset when I think about that, because it's just such a shame that we spent time then applying this to the real world.
So what's a moral context?
So moral contexts are ethics. So we have to think about the ethical implications of our research. I mean, part of that, example about the marshmallow test is ethical in that you've maybe wasted a lot of research, a lot of participants' time in doing a study that really didn't get us to an answer. So there's that. But in my research, for example, and something that will be considered in any clinical psychology research is about informed consent. So we want people to understand the nature of the research that we are doing and to like actively volunteer to do it.
Preach.
So it's really hard to get children to understand research and consent to it. So this is why we have a really careful way of asking their parent or guardian about whether they consent, but also asking the child if they want to do it in a way that they understand. So seeking child assent. But the same thing is true when I do research in prisons. The consent process is really involved because we need them to understand and not to feel coerced. Right. Do you know what I mean? To do it. Yeah. So it's any vulnerable populations that we really need to seek to make so this is, a skill that hopefully when we're talking about research, we need to be able to talk about it in a way that anyone could understand it and to make it in the language of the people that we're dealing with. So, I mean, you read a lot of consent forms that are really heavy in jargon, have citations to research, and I understand, students and trainees really want to be thorough and kind of be like, look, you can read the background research, but it's really important to be clear in those. You work with children.
I mean, sometimes with children is an example where you can even redesign the study slightly to make it easier to, not easier is not the right word, to make it so that children can give better informed consent. So I've done studies with spatial memory using virtual reality that I've designed so that I can just tell, a 4-year-old, you put this on and we play hide and seek with a virtual duck. Do you want to play? Right? So I haven't explained, I haven't given them any citations and things because they're 4, right? But basically at that point they understand what they're actually going to be doing, and I, generally get quite enthusiastic consent to that one. Yeah. But you could design that study in a way that it wasn't a hide and seek game with a duck. Is a different spatial memory task. So there's a lot to go on with this.
Yeah, and then you rely on parents being able to make those decisions, or guardians to make those decisions, or sometimes if they're in a residential facility, I might have to get consent from, or in loco parentis, which is kind of somebody acting in the way that a parent would. So sometimes a head teacher is like that in maybe a residential school. Or I've worked in detention centers where the kids have been found had to commit a crime or possibly committed a crime, but they haven't been tried and found guilty of that crime, but they're being held because they're a risk or whatever. In that case, we have to get consent from the juvenile justice services, the people at the detention center, and then also get consent from the parents either by phone. So, I mean, a lot of this takes, I would say there's more to ethics. There's things about risks and things like that. But I think a large part of any clinical research, for example, involves how do we get consent in a way that is not coerced? Yes. How do we not make the incentives too much that people can't say no. Right. So I remember I participated in a study where they were going to give me $20 for giving them blood to test and do research on. And, for me as a student, $20 was a lot of money. So I just did it because of the money. I didn't actually do it because I cared about, I don't even remember what the research was about. So I think there has to be some kind of balance, and maybe, and that's why a lot of places make contingencies about you can't put the amount of money that's going to be involved on the posters or any advertisements, things like this. So it's a big part to think about, and it's something that you'll probably pay attention to as you're looking at research.
Yeah.
But you'd have to know what they did. So how we kind of gave you an idea about selecting a research question. Sometimes you just observe something like, how people behave on Tinder, or people behave in a crisis like a pandemic.
Don't have any idea what you're talking about, Luna.
But like you said, we can also read literature where we then see a study and we go, wait, they did it like that? I think that it would be better if they did it
like this,
some other way.
Yeah.
Or
corroborate it.
Or you might have, for my case, I have people working in the NHS who say, I've got a problem within, not a problem, but like I have some question, some issue that I'm really interested in that's happening in my service. And it's either something just to understand the problem, or sometimes it's to solve the problem. But you think of a practical problem, or someone comes to you with a practical problem, and you, as the scientist, knows how to go through the literature, and using your expertise can then go, oh, okay, let's think about a really well-designed study to think about that problem and to actually research it rather than just observing it.
Yeah. And I mean, also, again, I'd like to just kind of gently point out that, like, when you think of a practical problem, it's possible that problem will be really big and that you're not going to be able to solve it in one study. You want to, I think successful scientists get in the mindset of making progress.
Yeah.
Right? You want to be further along than you were before the study started. And that doesn't always mean that you've got it solved, especially if you take on really big problems. Like I've been working with blind people in human echolocation, and we've been wanting to know more about what it's like to learn a new way to use your senses when you're already an adult. You're not going to solve that in one study. I'm probably not going to solve that in my lifetime.
Yeah. I think a lot of trainees come to me and want to do like really big studies. You know what I mean? Like so they say, well, there's this problem, and as they go along, the study gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then I have to just go, okay, let's pare this down because we can't do all of that. So yeah, it's really important. And then I just say, another trainee will do that in the future. But yeah, it's really frustrating to think like, you want to do something bigger. But you have to think about why this research question is a good one. So to consider that, researchers think about the scientific, the clinical importance, the scope of it, again, like how big, how little, the likely outcomes of the research. So what are you likely to find, and how are you then going to communicate that? What's the I always say, like, what's going to be your take-home message from it? And then whether psychological science will be advanced. So these are some questions that I found in a book, which was about and then I edited them, so they're slightly reworded. So why might this question be important? What is the scope of the question? What are the likely outcomes if I carry out this project? To what extent will knowledge be advanced? So that can be clinical knowledge, research, theory, anything like that, by the answer to this question. And then who would be interested in the results that I would obtain? So who is it going to impact, or who is going to be interested? So again, that could be other theorists or scientists, or it could be the public, it could be policymakers.
We're shooting high now, aren't we? Policymakers, pulling out the big guns. I mean, that's the dream, if you actually get someone who's in a policy-making position to actually do something different because of a study you did.
Yeah.
That's when you know you made it. And I think it's worth pointing out, this to me kind of links back to ethics. Like, you're asking people to volunteer their time and their effort and like a little tiny slice of their life to participate in your study. And if you have no idea what use this study could ever be, if you can't answer who will be interested in the results obtained, I feel like it's a little bit unethical. Like, you're asking people to give up a little piece of themselves and their time and everything. You have a responsibility to know why you're doing that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that's how research questions get posed. And I think even some of our trainees, a couple, will think of a research question, put it through to a proposal, and then have to change the research question. Yeah. Yeah. So, or maybe just modify it a little bit so that it does have those results be interesting. Because maybe before that they were very niche. Right. And anything that's really, really niche to like a particular service, so one particular clientele, with service users within the NHS, for example, so just a Manchester service, might not be something that we would like for a clinical doctorate thesis, for example, to be done.
But there are other ways that those questions can be answered if you're doing, a small scale evaluation of a service. That happens, but is usually not part of a doctorate. So that's where these things kind of get, jiggled a little bit to match the scope of a DCLIN project. So we do think about that as well. We talked a little bit about biases and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, people talk about those as being paradigms. How you think about the world. And I think given where you come from, what you've studied, where you've studied, a lot of those things can influence the paradigms that you bring. And also the subject that you study, right?
Oh, yeah.
So psychology... When I was doing my degree, I was doing psychology with a minor in sociology. So I was very much interested in the social structures, how people behave as a society, culture, all of that I thought was really interesting. So I did a lot on sociology. And also when I was doing my PhD, I studied a lot in criminology as well, which is kind of part of sociology. So I think my views are like a blend of psychology, criminology, sociology, which means that, the way that I think of, for example, I gave an example from my own research, juvenile delinquency. You can think of that as, being a lot of different things. It could be that somebody thinks of it as as functionalism. So it serves a purpose.
Yep.
Some people talk about, we have a lot of juvenile delinquency in certain societies where we ask children who reach puberty but have to wait until they're 21 or 18 to be able to do a lot of adult things. So there's this kind of maturity gap that people like Tammy Moffat talk about. And so that's part of the functionalism. It's a way for them to go, I'm an individual, I'm unique, I'm like an adult, and I want to be treated that way. Therefore, I'm going to smoke or drink or, something like this. So that's very kind of functionalist. An interaction between your environment and yourself. Some people think of it very much as a personality deficit, and that's it. Or some people look at just like the genes involved or heritability of delinquency. Some people, a lot of people combine these things, but there are kind of paradigms where you go, where your first thought might be, let's study this thing. Let's study the social structures. Let's study poverty. Let's study. So you have to be really mindful of the way that people are telling their kind of scientific story.
Yeah. I mean, basically what a paradigm does in this case is it gives you sort of a vocabulary to even try and make a theory out of, right? So, if you're looking at interactionism, then a lot of what, so if you're using the term the way I'm familiar with it, that's talking a lot about gene-environment interactions?
Part of it, yeah.
Right?
I think these terms are a little bit older, but yeah.
Okay. I thought it was kind of an old term. But anyway, then that's sort of your vocabulary for even making a theory, right? You're going to start asking questions about genes and environments.
Yeah.
Right? That's what's going to form it. Whereas another person might, for example, approach it with a different paradigm where they end up asking questions about social hierarchies.
Yeah. And then that determines exactly how they're going to design their study. And they're going to find different things. And they're going to have a different answer.
Right.
And they're going to conflict. Those answers might conflict, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And because they haven't tested each other's theories.
Yeah.
But, no one's gone over and been like, hey, somebody who doesn't believe in my theory, can you come over here and test it? I mean, It's good when those things happen, but they don't always happen.
Yeah. Ideally, two scientists working under different paradigms would end up with results that are compatible with each other, like sort of just different ways of describing the problem. But in reality, we're humans.
Yeah.
So, it is good to have multiple perspectives informing your research whenever possible.
Yeah. So I think it's good. We put a question at the bottom, what are your paradigms, to think about these things. How do you think about when you view a parent disciplining their child in public? What are your paradigms for that? How do you, initially think about that? Because that's going to tell you about what you think about the world. for example, like I was saying about juvenile delinquency, I mean, there's different ways of thinking about delinquency. This, one way is kind of thinking about it like it originates from childhood and, is based on like you said, a gene environment interaction. So, starts with a fussy temperament and tantrums, and then turns into, fighting and breaking and entering and other, and leads to antisocial behavior as an adult. So it depends on what your paradigm is for that. And do you think that's mainly an environmental issue, a genetic issue, or a heritability issue? All those things are going to influence the way that you design your studies then, and what you decide to measure.